The day before, it became known that the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Dmytro Kuleba, resigned. You met with him, including, I think, in March 2022, if I'm not mistaken. In your opinion, why did he leave? And maybe you have some personal characteristics. How was it for you to work with him? I saw him in action only once, so to speak. It was in Antalya, where the Antalya Diplomatic Forum was held. These are annual events that Turkey organizes. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mevlut Cavusoglu, was the head of the Foreign Policy Department at the time. He called me and really asked me to come because the Ukrainian side, and Kuleba in particular, conveyed this idea of a meeting with me to the Turks, and they asked that this meeting not be one-on-one, but in the presence of the Turkish minister. And considering that we never left a dialogue, I simply asked again how serious it all was, and he said that it was very serious because Kuleba said that he had something to tell me, and chronologically, it was March 2022. It was March 2022, shortly after the start of the special military operation, and we arrived in Antalya, and I came specifically. I had no plans to participate in this diplomatic conference, it just didn't fit into my schedule, but the Turks really asked. I reported to the president that the Ukrainian colleagues were going to tell us something. And the three of us met in Antalya in a separate room. At this meeting, which was opened by Cavusoglu, and then he passed the floor to Kuleba as the initiator of this contact. And Kuleba read from a piece of paper in good English what we heard every day, even before the start of the special military operation. That is, there was nothing new, nothing constructive there. The real work was done by delegations. On our side, the delegation was headed by presidential aide Volodymyr Medinsky. On the Ukrainian side, the main person was David Arakhamia, chairman of the Servant of the People faction in the Verkhovna Rada. Well, you know the rest. They met several times in Belarus and in Istanbul. They finally agreed on the basis of the principles that the Ukrainians brought. And these principles remain relevant today. Our president has spoken about this more than once. That if you want negotiations, then, firstly, let Zelensky cancel the decree that prohibits negotiations, at least this. And secondly, of course, these Istanbul principles guaranteed Ukraine's non-accession to NATO, the preservation of its non-aligned status, and they described security guarantees for Ukraine so that it would feel calm, but also security guarantees for the Russian Federation. Ukraine's non-accession to NATO is part of the guarantees addressed to us, and these principles remain in work. At least we are ready to return to them, but naturally, taking into account the new realities, because more than 2.5 years have passed since then. And President Putin outlined these realities on June 14. Speaking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when he formulated the path to resolving the situation between Ukraine, Russia and the West, so Kuleba said nothing more except the official position. I later asked Cavusoglu where was the message he wanted to convey. Well, he was surprised too, but I, in turn, did not particularly talk about any possible negotiations. I said that there is a negotiation process. Then it was going on in Belarus. Let's proceed from the fact that all the details can be discussed there. In your opinion, what is the reason for Kuleba's resignation, and what should we expect from the new minister? Well, I don't see any way to connect any expectations with what is happening in the Ukrainian leadership. It wasn't just Kuleba who resigned. There were 7 or 8 people, I think, including deputy prime ministers and heads of various funds. There is some kind of squabble in parliament, in the Verkhovna Rada. They are not letting someone go. They are approving someone's resignation. I am not very interested in this. There are versions that many are spreading around the information space, in particular, that Zelensky wants to change the leading part of the team, then blame them for failures, and again tell the West that now we will earn money. Just give us weapons. Someone thinks that these are rats fleeing the ship. I don't know, to be honest. I'm not particularly interested in this. Because Zelensky is not ready for honest negotiations. The West will not let him have honest negotiations. The West has set a goal, if not to dismember, although this is also voiced, then to radically weaken the Russian Federation, to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. Therefore, the West will not allow him to take any steps towards us. But he is no longer able to understand what meets the interests of the Ukrainian people. He has betrayed these interests many times. I will ask you another question about Putin's visit to Mongolia. Ukraine has just said that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin's visit to Mongolia is a heavy blow for Ukraine. What they meant was that the International Criminal Court had not arrested anyone. In general, we have already talked about the role of this court. Has the International Criminal Court discredited itself? And should we think about creating some kind of international court on the basis of BRICS? Regarding the statements that Ukrainian officials make about third countries and about the relations of third countries with the Russian Federation, it is difficult to call this anything other than rudeness. Let's not forget that after Narendra Modi's visit to the Russian Federation, Zelensky personally said that Modi had dealt a fatal blow to efforts to resolve the conflict. However, the Indian Prime Minister nevertheless went to Kyiv later, and I am sure that he explained to Zelensky that decent people do not behave like that. At least, I hope so. Regarding the International Criminal Court, this topic did not arise at all in our preparations for the visit to the Mongolian capital. In my opinion, this topic is being artificially hyped up. This is what the West wants, not at all embarrassed by double standards, because you know that the Americans themselves are not parties to the statute. When the International Criminal Court, or rather its prosecutor, tried to open a court case regarding those outright war crimes that were committed in Afghanistan, including by the Americans, the British, and the Australians, there they simply ground weddings into dust, just in case, because something was moving. They did not even look at who it was, why, they bombed to death. There were tens and hundreds of victims. And when the International Criminal Court tried to deal with these court cases, the Americans said that they would immediately declare sanctions against this court. But just recently history repeated itself. When the International Criminal Court hinted at the need to put the Israeli leadership on the wanted list, the hegemon immediately slapped their hands, and these conversations died down. And against this background, when the same United States demands that all countries fulfill their sacred duty and arrest Putin, well, you know, I think that even a person inexperienced in politics understands how much this not only smells of double standards, but simply consists of them. But, I will emphasize once again, we in BRICS are guided by international law. And international law, which has ensured and guaranteed the immunity of heads of state for many, many years, is much older and wiser than the statute of the International Criminal Court, which is only a couple of decades old and which is not universal. And the norms I am talking about, they are universal. I will ask you one last question about the detention of Pavel Durov in France. Are there any contacts with him? And in general, what are we going to do? We immediately contacted the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a request to provide us with information about what was happening and to provide consular access. We sent an official note. We contacted his lawyers, who promised to take into account our offer of assistance in this matter. After that, neither the lawyer nor Pavel Durov himself responded to our offer of assistance, of consular access. We continue to work with the French to obtain the most detailed and understandable information, but they proceed from the fact that since he has French citizenship and he was detained on French territory, French law applies, and that his French citizenship in this case takes precedence. Well, they convince us, and Macron spoke personally, that there is no politics here, but it is very difficult to believe, and that line of seizing any at least slightly popular and significant information resources. This line has been pursued by the West for a long time. By the way, if we talk about France, then in 1990 the OSCE held another summit in Paris. And there the Paris Charter for a New Europe was adopted, as well as many documents in line with universal human values, one of which was freedom of information, including access to information. In a special section it was written that the OSCE countries solemnly promise to provide their citizens with access to information, any information, both within their countries and to information that comes from abroad and is generated in other OSCE countries. All this was crossed out a long time ago, long before the Ukrainian events. I remember very well when we still held regular meetings with my French colleagues. At each meeting I asked them why the Élysée Palace still does not give accreditation to RT and Sputnik. And they answered us that these are not mass media, but these are propaganda tools.